November 29, 1970. Bergen, Norway. A woman's body is found in a remote valley, burned beyond recognition. She carried no identification. Her fingerprints had been deliberately removed. This is not fiction. These are real cases, real people, real evidence that leads nowhere. What you're about to hear contains disturbing details from actual criminal investigations. Some listeners may find this content unsettling. Tonight, we examine 6 cases separated by decades and thousands of miles. Cases where the evidence exists, where the facts are documented, but where the truth remains just beyond reach. 6 investigations, 6 silences, and questions that have never been answered. There are crimes that defy resolution not because evidence is absent, but because the evidence itself creates more questions than answers. These are not mysteries wrapped in speculation or urban legend. They are documented failures of understanding, preserved in police files, autopsy reports, and witness statements that investigators have studied for generations. What connects a burned body in Norway to a farmhouse murder in Bavaria? What links a small-town tragedy in Iowa to a series of attacks in California? On the surface, nothing. Different eras, different continents, different methods. But beneath the particulars, these cases share something more fundamental. They represent moments when the ordinary world revealed itself to be far more fragile than anyone imagined. Moments when someone walked into a life or a home or a community and then walked away, leaving behind only questions. The cases you're about to hear are not chosen for their brutality. They're chosen because they remain open. Because despite decades of investigation, public attention, and technological advancement, no one has successfully explained what happened or why. The people involved were real. The investigations were thorough. The evidence was collected, cataloged, and analyzed, and yet the answers never came. This is not a story about what we know. It's a story about what we don't, about the specific, documented moments when certainty gave way to silence, about the particular details that investigators returned to again and again, searching for the explanation that has so far eluded everyone. These are cases where the passage of time has not brought clarity, where each new theory seems to raise more objections than it resolves, where the evidence, carefully preserved, continues to resist interpretation. We'll move through them chronologically, beginning in 1970 and working backward to the 20th century, examining what was found, what was documented, and what remains inexplicable. Some of these cases you may have heard of, others may be unfamiliar, but all of them share a common characteristic. They force us to confront the limits of what can be known, even when the facts are right in front of us. The Isdal woman. The Isdalen Valley, just outside Bergen, Norway, is not the kind of place where people go by accident. It's remote, accessible only by hiking trails that wind through dense forest and over rocky terrain. In late November, it's cold, often shrouded in mist. The name translates to Ice Valley. On November 29, 1970, a father and his 2 young daughters were hiking through the area when they noticed something unusual among the rocks. At first, they thought it might be a sleeping bag. As they got closer, they realized it was a body. The woman was lying on her back, partially burned. Her face was so severely damaged that identification through normal means would be impossible. She was positioned against a large rock, and around her were the remnants of what appeared to be a deliberate fire. Nearby, investigators found several items: empty bottles that contained gasoline, burnt remnants of a passport, and various pieces of jewelry, also partially melted. The Bergen police responded immediately. This was clearly not a typical hiking accident. The location was isolated, difficult to reach, and the evidence of fire suggested something more complex than a natural death. The autopsy revealed several crucial details. The woman had died from carbon monoxide poisoning and smoke inhalation, consistent with the fire found at the scene. However, she had also consumed a significant quantity of sleeping pills. Her death was officially listed as likely suicide, but this conclusion would become increasingly difficult to accept as the investigation progressed. Physical examination showed she was approximately 30 to 40 years old, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, with brown hair. But the most unusual finding came from her fingerprints. The skin on her fingertips showed signs of deliberate abrasion. Someone had attempted to remove or damage the fingerprints, making standard identification impossible. Among her belongings, investigators found items that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. There were clothing labels from multiple countries. Some tags were removed entirely. Others indicated purchases from different European cities. Her suitcases, eventually located at a Bergen railway station, contained wigs, loose change from several nations, and prescription glasses with clear non-prescription lenses. The burnt passport fragments were traced to multiple false identities. The woman had checked into various hotels throughout Bergen and other Norwegian cities under different names during the weeks before her death. Each identity appeared to be fabricated. The addresses given on hotel registration cards led nowhere. The names themselves could not be connected to any real person. Hotel staff who remembered her provided descriptions that were surprisingly consistent. She spoke several languages fluently. She was well-dressed, polite, and unremarkable in her behavior. She paid in cash and never stayed anywhere for more than a few nights. She seemed nervous, some recalled, but not overtly distressed. Investigators traced her movements backward. Over the weeks preceding her death, she had traveled extensively throughout Norway and neighboring countries, always using false names, always moving between hotels, always paying cash. At one hotel in Bergen, staff members recalled that she seemed worried about being followed. She requested rooms that were not on the ground floor and asked about alternative exits. In her suitcases, police found a collection of handwritten codes. The notes appeared to be some form of shorthand or cipher, containing combinations of letters and numbers that did not correspond to any known system. Cryptographers examined the codes but could not definitively break them. Some theorized they might be travel notes or meeting times. Others suggested they could be entirely personal notations. The codes have never been fully explained. Perhaps most unsettling were the findings related to her final movements. The place where her body was found was difficult to access. The hike required local knowledge and physical capability. It was not a location that a tourist would randomly choose. And yet, there was no evidence that anyone had accompanied her there. No footprints other than hers were found in the immediate area. The condition of her body raised additional questions. She had been severely burned, particularly around the face and upper body. The fire was hot enough to destroy identifying features, but appeared to have been set while she was already dying or recently deceased. The sleeping pills in her system would have rendered her unconscious. The position of the body suggested she had not tried to escape the flames. Two scenarios emerged in the official investigation. The first was suicide. A woman, for unknown reasons, had gone to great lengths to hide her identity, traveled to a remote location, consumed lethal quantities of medication, and arranged for her body to be burned, presumably to prevent identification even after death. The second scenario was considerably darker. Someone else had been involved. The fingerprint damage, the false identities, the coded notes, and elaborate travel patterns suggested something beyond simple suicide. Some investigators began to suspect espionage. During the Cold War, Norway occupied a strategically significant position. Soviet submarines regularly patrolled nearby waters. Western intelligence agencies maintained a strong presence in Scandinavian countries. The Istel woman's behavior, her multilingual capabilities, her constant movement, and her obvious efforts to avoid identification fit a pattern that intelligence professionals would recognize. Witness reports placed her in the company of various men during her time in Norway. These men were never identified. Some hotel staff recalled seeing her with well-dressed individuals who did not register at the hotels themselves. One witness reported seeing her in intense conversation with a man in a restaurant, speaking what sounded like German or possibly Russian. The man left before she did, and no one could provide a useful description of him. Chemical analysis of her stomach contents revealed the sleeping pills, but also traced evidence of the types of food she had eaten in the hours before death. The meal was not consistent with typical hotel or restaurant food. It suggested she had eaten elsewhere, possibly at a private residence, shortly before traveling to Istelen. The Bergen police conducted an extensive investigation. Interpol was contacted. Her photograph, carefully reconstructed despite the facial damage, was circulated across Europe. Despite this, no one came forward to identify her. No missing person report matched her description. No family ever claimed her body. Theories multiplied over the years. Was she a spy who knew too much? Was she fleeing from something or someone? Did she orchestrate her own death to escape a threat? Or was she killed by others who then staged a scene to look like suicide? Physical evidence suggested planning and deliberation. The gasoline bottles did not come from nearby. She would have had to carry them to the site. The sleeping pills were taken in sufficient quantity to be fatal, suggesting either a genuine suicide attempt or forced consumption. The coded notes were never found correspond to any known cipher system, but their existence implied organization and purpose. In the decades since, DNA analysis has been attempted. The results have confirmed she was likely of European origin, but the database matches have been inconclusive. Genealogical research using modern techniques has not yet produced a confirmed identity. The woman's family, if she had one, never came forward. What remains is this. A woman went extraordinary lengths to conceal her identity, traveled extensively under false names, carried coded notes that no one could read, and died in a remote valley under circumstances that suggest both suicide and murder. The Norwegian police officially closed the case in 1971, but it was never solved. Her body was buried in Bergen in a zinc coffin, a preservation method chosen specifically because authorities believe that future technology might someday identify her. That day has not yet come. The Istel woman has become one of Norway's most enduring mysteries, not because of the violence of her death, but because of the profound silence surrounding her life. Someone, somewhere, must have known who she was. Someone might have known why she died. But if they do, they have never spoken. The Hinterkaifeck murders. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, 6 people were murdered on a small farm in Bavaria. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck, located about 50 miles north of Munich, isolated even by rural standards. The nearest neighbors were some distance away. The family who lived there, the Grubers, had no telephone. Help, if needed, would not come quickly. The victims were Andreas Gruber, age 63, the head of the household, his wife, Kille, 72, their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35, Victoria's children, Kille, 7, and Joseph, 2, and Maria Baumgartner, 44, the family's maid, who had arrived at the farm only hours before the murders occurred. The farm was discovered 4 days later, on April 4th, when neighbors noticed that no one from the household had been seen for several days. The children had not attended school. The family had missed church services. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. When local residents entered the property, they found all 6 bodies in various locations around the farm. 4 of the victims were in the barn. They had been killed with a mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe. The wounds indicated extreme violence. Multiple blows to the head, delivered with enough force to penetrate the skull. The bodies were partially covered with hay. The 2 youngest victims, the children, were found in their beds inside the house. They too had been killed with blows to the head. The scene suggested they had been attacked while sleeping or shortly after being awakened. There were signs that the younger child, Joseph, had lived for several hours after being injured, biting through his own bedding in pain. The investigation, led by Munich police, immediately focused on several deeply unsettling details that distinguished this from a typical farm robbery or spontaneous attack. First, the timing. Evidence suggested the adults had been killed on the evening of March 31st, likely while doing their evening chores in the barn. The children were killed later, possibly that same night or early the following morning. The difference in timing implied calculation. Someone had remained on the property, waiting. Second, the evidence suggested that whoever killed the family had stayed in the house for several days afterward. Neighbors reported seeing smoke from the chimney on April 1st and 2nd, well after the murders had occurred. The farm animals had been fed and cared for. Food had been prepared and eaten in the kitchen. Someone had been living there, surrounded by the bodies. Third, in the days leading up to the murders, Andreas Gruber had mentioned strange occurrences to several people. He told neighbors that he had found footprints in the snow, leading from the forest to the farm, but not leading away. He reported hearing footsteps in the attic. Keys had gone missing. He heard unexplained sounds at night. His daughter Victoria had also expressed unease, telling someone in the village that she felt they were being watched. The previous maid had left employment at Hinterkaifeck 6 months earlier, telling others that she believed the farm was haunted. She refused to return. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived on the afternoon of March 31st, the day of the murders. She was killed that same evening, having been at the farm for only a few hours. The crime scene itself presented numerous mysteries. There was no sign of forced entry into the house or barn. Nothing significant appeared to have been stolen. Money was found in the house, untouched. The violence seemed focused and personal, not the work of a panic robber. The murder weapon, a mattock, belonged to the farm. It was found at the scene, suggesting the killer had not brought a weapon, but had used what was available. This implied familiarity with the location, and perhaps a lack of premeditation, or at least a willingness to improvise. The Munich police conducted an extensive investigation. More than 100 people were interviewed. Numerous suspects were considered. Several individuals were arrested and questioned, but each was eventually released due to insufficient evidence. One early theory centered on Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel. He had been reported killed during World War I, but his body was never positively identified. Some speculated that he might have survived, returned, and killed his family for reasons unknown. However, no evidence ever emerged to support this theory, and it was eventually abandoned. Another suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had been romantically involved with Victoria and was widely believed to be the father of her youngest child, Joseph. Schlittenbauer's behavior raised suspicions. He was among the first to enter the farm when the bodies were discovered, and witnesses reported that he did not seem surprised by what he found. He went directly to certain locations, as if he knew what to expect. However, he had a partial alibi, and no physical evidence connected him to the crimes. Several other individuals came under scrutiny. A vagrant who had been seen in the area, a former employee of the farm who had been dismissed, various traveling workers who had passed through the region. Each theory raised questions, but none could be substantiated. The investigation was hampered by several factors. The bodies had lain undiscovered for 4 days, complicating forensic analysis. The crime scene had been partially disturbed by those who discovered it, and the rural setting meant that potential witnesses were few and far between. In an unusual attempt to advance the investigation, the victims' heads were removed during autopsy and sent to Munich for examination by forensic specialists. The technique of facial reconstruction was being developed at the time, and authorities hoped that detailed study might reveal something useful. It did not. The heads were never returned for burial, and their current whereabouts remain unknown, adding another layer of strangeness to an already bizarre case. The farm itself was demolished in 1923, less than a year after murders. The land was sold, and a new structure was eventually built nearby. Local residents avoided the site for years. Stories circulated about the haunted farm, about the sound of footsteps and voices heard by those who passed too close. Over the decades, the Hinterkaifeck murders have been re-examined numerous times. Historians and criminologists have proposed various theories. Some suggest it was the work of a drifter, someone who had been hiding in the forest and used the farm for shelter. Others propose that it was someone the family knew, someone who had access and knowledge of their routines. The fact that the killer remained on the property for days suggests a level of comfort and perhaps even a connection to the location. Feeding the animals and eating in the house are not the actions of a panicked murderer fleeing the scene. They suggest someone who felt safe there, at least temporarily, or someone who had nowhere else to go. The footprints Andreas Gruber mentioned, leading from the forest to the farm but not away, have never been explained. Were they old tracks he had simply not noticed before? Were they evidence of someone surveying the property? Or were they something else entirely? The attic, where Andreas reported hearing sounds, was never thoroughly searched until after the murders. When investigators finally examined it, they found signs that someone might have been living there, a makeshift bed, evidence of food consumption. But whether this was related to the murders or simply a vagrant who had since moved on could not be determined. What is certain is that 6 people were killed with extraordinary violence in a location where they should have been safe, that the killer knew the farm or took time to learn it, that he or she was not afraid to remain on the property for days, and that despite an intensive investigation, numerous suspects, and nearly a century of speculation, no one has ever been conclusively identified as responsible. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain open in German police records, though no active investigation continues. The case files are preserved, available to researchers, but they contain no resolution. Only questions that have outlasted everyone who might have known the answers. The Villisca axe murders. On the morning of June 10, 1912, in the small town of Villisca, Iowa, 8 people were found dead in a single house. The victims were J.B. Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 young girls who were guests, staying overnight after attending a church event. The children ranged in age from 12 down to 5 years old. All 8 had been killed while they slept, bludgeoned with the blunt side of an axe. The weapon was found at the scene, leaning against a wall in the guest bedroom, left behind by whoever had used it. Villisca was a quiet farming community, a place where doors were often left unlocked, where neighbors knew each other by name. The Moore family was well regarded. Josiah Moore was a businessman, involved in local organizations. The family was active in the Presbyterian Church. The 2 visiting children, Lena and Ina Stillinger, were daughters of a neighboring family. On the evening of June 9th, the entire group had attended a children's program at the church, arriving home around 10 o'clock. Neighbors saw lights on in the house shortly afterward, then darkness. Everything appeared normal. By morning, none of them were alive. The discovery was made by a neighbor, Mary Peckham, who grew concerned when she noticed that the Moore house remained silent and closed well past the usual morning routine. The family's chickens had not been let out. No one responded to her knocks. She contacted Josiah's brother, who had a key. When they entered, they found a scene of methodical violence. Each victim had been struck in the head multiple times. The blows were delivered with such force that skulls were fractured. Faces were rendered unrecognizable. The bedding was soaked with blood, but despite the brutality, there had been no struggle, no signs that any of the victims had fought back or even fully awakened before they were killed. The killer had worked through the house systematically. The adults were attacked first, in the downstairs bedroom, then the 4 more children in the upstairs room. Finally, the 2 Stillinger girls in the guest room. The entire household had been murdered without anyone managing to cry out or escape. But what made the Villisca murders particularly disturbing were the actions taken after the killings. The murderer had not fled immediately. Instead, he or she had spent time in the house, engaging in behavior that suggested ritual or compulsion rather than simple violence. Every mirror in the house had been covered, either with clothing or turned to face the wall. The windows were similarly obscured, curtains drawn and fastened. A piece of bacon had been left in the downstairs bedroom. Bowls of water had been placed around the house, some containing what appeared to be bloody water. The axe belonged to Josiah Moore. It had been stored in the house. Like the Hinterkaifeck case, the weapon had not been brought by the intruder, but taken from the premises. This suggested either opportunity or familiarity with the home's layout. Investigators found evidence that the killer might have been hiding in the house before the family returned from church. The attic access showed signs of disturbance. There was a depression in dust, suggesting someone had been waiting there. The theory emerged that the murderer had entered earlier, perhaps while the house was empty, and concealed himself until the family was asleep. The crime attracted immediate and intense attention. Villisca was a small town, and the magnitude of the murders overwhelmed local resources. Investigators from larger cities arrived. The Bureau of Investigation, precursor to the FBI, was consulted. Reporters descended on the community. Hundreds of people walked through the crime scene in the days following the discovery, contaminating evidence and complicating forensic analysis. Suspicion fell on numerous individuals. A traveling minister named George Kelly became a primary suspect. Kelly had been in Villisca on the night of the murders and had left town the following morning. He was known to have mental health issues and later confessed to the killings, though he recanted and was eventually acquitted at trial. The confession was deemed unreliable, possibly the product of his psychological instability rather than genuine guilt. Another suspect was Frank Jones, a local businessman who had been in a bitter dispute with Josiah Moore over business matters. Jones was a respected member of the community, but rumors persisted that he might have hired someone to kill his rival. A man named William Mansfield, who had worked for Jones, came under scrutiny. Mansfield had a criminal history and was known to travel extensively. He was also linked to several other similar crimes. However, despite investigations and even exhumations to gather evidence, no charges were ever filed. The Villisca murders were not an isolated incident. In the years before and after 1912, a series of similar crimes occurred across the Midwest. Entire families killed with axes in the night, mirrors covered, crime scenes staged in peculiar ways. In Colorado Springs, Colorado, in Monmouth and Ellsworth, Illinois, in Powell, Kansas, the similarities were striking enough that investigators began to suspect a serial offender, someone who traveled from town to town, selecting victims and killing entire households. But no connection was ever definitively established. The different jurisdictions did not coordinate effectively. Evidence was not shared systematically. If there was a single perpetrator behind multiple crimes, he was never identified. In Villisca itself, the murders left a permanent mark. The Moore house stood empty for years. Locals avoided it. Stories of hauntings emerged, reports of strange sounds and lights. Eventually, it was sold and occupied again, but the history lingered. Modern researchers have re-examined the evidence using contemporary forensic techniques. The crime scene photographs, preserved in archives, have been analyzed. The patterns of blood spatter, the positioning of bodies, the sequence of events have all been reconstructed. But even with advanced methodologies, no consensus has emerged about the killer's identity. Some theories suggest the murderer knew the family, that this was personal rather than random. The fact that the house was chosen specifically, that the killer waited inside, suggests planning. Other theories point to the transient nature of early 20th century America, where men moved from town to town seeking work, where strangers were common, and where someone could commit a crime and disappear without much difficulty. What remains undisputed is that on a June night in 1912, someone entered a house in Iowa, killed 8 people with an axe, covered the mirrors, and left without being seen. Despite investigations, trial, confessions, and decades of speculation, that person was never held accountable. The Villisca case files remain open. The house still stands, now a museum of sorts, preserved much as it was. Visitors can walk through the rooms, see where the family slept, stand in the spaces where unimaginable violence occurred. But the walls offer no answers, only the same silence that has persisted for more than a century. The Keddy Cabin Murders. On the morning of April 12, 1981, Sheila Sharp, age 14, returned to her family's cabin in Keddy, California, after spending the night at a neighbor's house. She opened the door and found her mother, her brother, and a family friend dead in the living room. They had been bound, beaten, and stabbed. The violence had occurred sometime during the night, while other members of the family slept in adjacent rooms. Keddy was a small resort community in the Sierra Nevada mountains, about 2 hours north of Sacramento. The Sharp family lived in Cabin 28, part of a small complex of rental units that had once served tourists but had fallen into disrepair. The cabins were close together. Neighbors were nearby, and yet no one reported hearing anything unusual that night. The victims were Sue Sharp, 36, the mother of 5 children, her son John, 15, and John's friend Dana Wingate, 17, who had been visiting. All 3 had been attacked in the living room with multiple weapons, knives, a hammer, and possibly other objects. The injuries were severe and numerous. The medical examiner would later determine that the attack had been prolonged, that the victims had suffered before dying. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the scene was what was missing. Sue's daughter Tina, 12 years old, was not in the cabin. Her body was not among those found. She had simply vanished. In the other bedrooms, 3 younger children had slept through the entire event. Sheila's 2 younger brothers, ages 10 and 5, and a friend who was staying over. They were found unharmed the next morning, apparently having heard nothing. This detail alone raised troubling questions. How could such extreme violence occur in a small cabin without waking children sleeping just feet away? The Keddy cabin was not large. The walls were thin. The living room where the murders occurred was centrally located. And yet, the children in the back bedroom never woke, never called for help, never knew their family members were being killed nearby. The investigation began immediately, led by the Plumas County Sheriff's Department. The scene was chaotic. Blood evidence covered the living room. The murder weapons, or some of them, were found at the scene, but critical evidence was mishandled almost from the start. Investigators failed to properly secure the crime scene. Neighbors and others walked to the cabin before it was fully processed. Evidence was not photographed comprehensively. Some items were moved or disturbed before being documented. In the years that followed, it would become clear that the initial investigation suffered from serious procedural failures. Despite these problems, certain facts emerged. The attack had likely occurred between midnight and 2 in the morning. There were signs that more than one attacker had been involved. The violence suggested rage or frenzy, but also a degree of control. The victims had been bound with electrical cord and medical tape. Someone had brought tape to the scene, implying premeditation. Witnesses reported seeing unusual activity in kille that night. A car was spotted near cabin 28 around the time of the murders. People reported hearing sounds from the cabin, but dismissed them as an argument or roughhousing. No one called the police. Suspicion quickly focused on several individuals who were known to the Sharp family. Sue Sharp had recently separated from her husband and moved to kille with her children to start over. She had made friends in the community, but she had also had conflicts with neighbors. One name that emerged repeatedly was Martin Smart, who lived in the adjacent cabin with his wife and friend. Smart was known to have a volatile temper. Neighbors had heard arguments coming from his cabin. Some reported that he seemed obsessed with Sue Sharp, that he made inappropriate comments about her. Smart's friend, John Bobade, also came under scrutiny. Bobade had been staying at Smart's cabin and was described by some as aggressive and unstable. Both men were questioned by police but never arrested. Both had alibis, though those alibis were not thoroughly verified at the time. Years later, evidence would emerge that seemed to implicate Smart and Bobade. A letter was found among Smart's possessions after his death, a rambling and disturbing piece of writing that appeared to reference the murders. A hammer similar to one used in the killings was discovered, but by then, both suspects were dead. Smart died in 2000, Bobade in 1988. Neither was ever charged. The question of why the children in the back bedroom were not harmed has never been satisfactorily answered. Were they spared deliberately? Did the killers simply not realize they were there? Or were they awake and pretending to sleep, traumatized into silence? The disappearance of Tina Sharp added another dimension to the horror. For 3 years, her fate remained unknown. Then, in April 1984, her skull was found in a rural area about 50 miles from kille. The remains were scattered, likely by animals. Forensic analysis confirmed it was Tina, but provided little information about how or when she died. The discovery meant that Tina had not died in the cabin with her mother and brother. She had either been taken alive from the scene or had fled and been pursued. The timeline of her death could not be established with certainty, but evidence suggested she had not survived long after that April night. Theories about the murders multiplied. Some believed it was a personal attack, motivated by obsession or revenge. Others suggested drug connections. Kille, like many rural areas in the 1980s, had problems with drug trafficking. Sue Sharp's estranged husband was mentioned as a potential suspect, though he was never seriously pursued by investigators. The mishandling of evidence has made resolution difficult. Crime scene photographs were incomplete. Fingerprints collected at the scene were not properly analyzed or entered into databases. DNA evidence existed, but was not processed using modern techniques until decades later. In 2013, the Plumas County Sheriff's Department announced that new evidence had been found linking Martin Smart and John Bobade to the murders. This included a letter, additional witness statements, and reanalysis of physical evidence. But with both men deceased, prosecution was impossible. The case was effectively closed without a trial. For the survivors, the lack of justice has been a source of ongoing pain. Sheila Sharp, who discovered the bodies, has spoken publicly about the trauma and the frustration of watching suspects go uncharged. The younger brothers, who slept through the attack, have carried their own burdens of survivors' guilt and unanswered questions. The Kille cabin has since been demolished. The resort community where the Sharp family once lived has changed, but the memory of April 1981 persists. For years, the case represented a particular kind of failure, not just an unsolved crime, but one where the solution might have been within reach if the investigation had been handled differently. Even now, with the sheriff's department officially naming suspects, doubts remain. Were Smart and Babade truly responsible? Or were they convenient scapegoats, men with troubled histories who couldn't defend themselves? The physical evidence, compromised by poor handling, cannot provide definitive answers. What is certain is that 3 people were brutally murdered in a small cabin while children slept nearby, that a 12-year-old girl was taken and killed, that the investigation failed to secure a prosecution, and that decades later, the families of the victims still do not have the closure that a trial might have provided. The Kille cabin murders remain a case study in how evidence can be lost, how witnesses can be overlooked, and how time can erase the possibility of justice. The questions persist, and so does the grief. The Springfield Three. On the morning of June 7, 1992, in Springfield, Missouri, 3 women vanished from a house without any sign of struggle, forced entry, or explanation. They left behind their cars, their purses, their clothes, and every indication that they would return shortly. But they never did. The victims were Cheryl Levitt, 47, and her daughter, Susie Streeter, 19. The third was Susie's friend, Stacy McCall, 18. Susie and Stacy had just graduated from high school the previous day and had spent the evening celebrating. They returned to Cheryl's house around 2:30 in the morning and apparently went to sleep. By the next day, all 3 were gone. The circumstances of their disappearance would become one of the most analyzed and debated cases in modern American crime history, not because of violence or spectacle, but because of profound absence of evidence. They simply ceased to exist. Stacy's parents became concerned when their daughter did not call them as planned. When they could not reach her by phone, they went to the Levitt house. They found the door unlocked. Inside, everything appeared normal. Beds had been slept in. Makeup and jewelry were laid out, as if the women had been preparing to go somewhere. The television was on, but the women themselves were gone. Their purses were in the house. Their cars were parked outside. Money and valuables were untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no evidence of forced entry. The broken porch light outside the front door was the only thing even slightly unusual, and even that could have been a coincidence, an accident unrelated to the disappearances. Friends of Stacy and Susie began arriving at the house during the morning, concerned when the 2 girls did not show up for planned activities. Several people entered the house, walked through it, even cleaned up minor messes, before anyone thought to call the police. By the time investigators arrived, the crime scene, if it was a crime scene, had been significantly compromised. The Springfield Police Department began what would become a massive investigation. Hundreds of people were interviewed. The women's lives were examined in detail. Cheryl was a hairdresser, divorced, living a quiet life. Susie was a popular high school student with plans to attend college. Stacy was similarly well-liked, with no known enemies or problems. None of the 3 had any apparent reason to disappear voluntarily. The phone records from the house showed that a call had been made to Cheryl's number around 8 o'clock on the morning of June 7th. The caller did not leave a message, and the source of the call was never traced. Some investigators believe this might have been the kidnapper checking to see if the house was empty, or if anyone had discovered the disappearance yet. But this remains speculation. Another detail that emerged was a series of obscene phone calls that had been received at the house in the weeks before the disappearance. Cheryl had mentioned them to friends, saying they made her uncomfortable. The calls were never traced, and their connection to the disappearance, if any, could not be established. Witnesses reported seeing a suspicious van near the Levitt house around the time the women were last seen. Other witnesses mentioned unfamiliar vehicles in the neighborhood. None of these sightings led anywhere concrete. The descriptions were vague, the memories uncertain. The police pursued numerous theories. Had someone targeted Cheryl specifically? She had gone through a divorce, and investigators looked closely at her ex-husband, but he had an alibi and no apparent motive. Did someone know Susie and Stacy would be staying at the house that night? The girls' plans had changed at the last minute. They had originally intended to stay elsewhere, but decided to go to Cheryl's house instead. If someone had been planning to target them, how would they have known where to find them? The lack of evidence made every scenario seem equally possible and equally unlikely. A stranger abduction seemed improbable given the absence of forced entry and struggle. But if the women knew their abductor, why would all three of them leave willingly in the middle of the night, leaving behind everything they owned? One theory suggested that the broken porch light was significant. Perhaps someone had broken it to create darkness near the front door, making it easier to approach the house unseen. Or perhaps one of the women had accidentally broken it when arriving home and it meant nothing at all. The case generated massive publicity. Psychics offered their services. Anonymous tips poured in by the thousands. Investigators followed every lead, but none produced results. Ground was excavated at various locations based on tips. Suspects were questioned and released. Years passed with no breakthrough. In 1997, a construction crew was working on a parking garage in downtown Springfield, directly across from courthouse. A woman called in a tip claiming that the three women were buried under the concrete foundation of the garage. She provided specific details about the location. The police took the tip seriously enough to investigate, but ultimately decided that excavating the garage would be too expensive and disruptive without more solid evidence. The garage was never excavated, and the tip has become one of the most persistent and controversial aspects of the case. To this day, some believe the women are buried there. Over the years, several individuals have been considered as suspects. Convicted criminals whose timelines place them in Springfield in June 1992. Men with histories of violence against women. But in each case, the evidence was insufficient for charges. Some suspects have died. Others have been in prison for unrelated crimes. None have been definitively linked to the disappearance of the Springfield Three. The psychological impact of this case extends beyond the usual boundaries of unsolved crimes. When someone is murdered, there is at least a body, a definitive ending, however tragic. When someone disappears, the ambiguity itself becomes a form of torture for those left behind. The families cannot grieve fully because they do not know what happened. They cannot achieve closure because there is no ending. Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, has spent decades advocating for her daughter's case, giving interviews, pushing for new investigations, refusing to let the disappearance fade from public memory. She has said that not knowing is worse than almost any alternative. At least with certainty, there could be some form of acceptance. The house where the women were last seen has changed hands multiple times. Each new owner has had to contend with the history, with the curious visitors, with the knowledge that something inexplicable happened there. The house itself offers no answers. It's just a house. The mystery exists not in the physical space, but in the absence it represents. Modern technology has brought renewed attention to the case. DNA analysis, cell phone tracking, digital forensics, all tools that did not exist or not widely used in 1992. The Springfield Police Department has stated that the case remains open and that they continue to pursue leads. But as years turn into decades, the likelihood of resolution diminishes. What happened to the Springfield Three? Did they leave the house voluntarily with someone they knew? Were they forced out at gunpoint, threatened into silence? Did they go outside to investigate a noise and get taken? Was it planned or opportunistic? One person or multiple? The questions have no answers. The evidence, such as it is, points in too many directions and also in none. 3 women went to sleep in a house in Missouri. By morning, they were gone. And in all the years since, despite investigations, publicity, and technological advances, no one has been able to explain where they went or why. Their families wait. The community remembers. And the case remains active, a testament to how completely someone can vanish, even in the modern world. Even with every resource devoted to finding them. The Zodiac Killer, between December 1968 and October 1969, a series of attacks occurred in Northern California that would define decades of criminal investigation and popular culture fascination. The perpetrator called himself the Zodiac and claimed responsibility for multiple murders, though the exact number of victims remains disputed. What is confirmed? At least 5 people were attacked, and at least 2 survived. What is documented? The Zodiac sent letters to newspapers, included ciphers, and taunted police with details only the killer would know. What remains uncertain? The identity of the person who did these things. The first confirmed attack occurred on December 20th, 1968, on Lake Herman Road, a secluded area in Benicia, California. David Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16, were shot and killed while parked in David's car. They were students, out on a first date. Someone approached the vehicle and opened fire without warning. David was shot in the head. Betty Lou was shot 5 times in the back as she tried to run. Both died at the scene. The crime initially appeared to be a random attack, perhaps a robbery gone wrong. But there was no robbery. Nothing was taken from the victims or the car. The shooter simply killed and left. 7 months later, on July 4th, 1969, another couple was attacked in a similar location, this time at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, about 4 miles from the first crime scene. Darlene Farron, 22, and Michael Mageau, 19, were sitting in Darlene's car when someone pulled up beside them, shined a bright light into the vehicle, and began shooting. Michael was shot multiple times, but survived. Darlene died from her injuries. About 40 minutes after the attack, a man called the Vallejo Police Department. He spoke calmly, gave a location of the shooting, and then said, "I also killed those kids last year." He was referring to the Lake Herman Road murders. Then he hung up. The call was traced to a phone booth, but led nowhere. On August 1st, 1969, 3 letters arrived at 3 different Bay Area newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter contained similar text, claiming responsibility for the murders and demanding publication. Each letter also included 1/3 of a cipher, a cryptogram of strange symbols. The writer stated that the cipher contained his identity. The letters were signed with a cross-circle symbol. They included details about the crimes that had not been released to the public, proving the writer had specific knowledge of the murders. He referred to ammunition types, body positioning, and other details that only the killer or someone very close to the investigation would know. The cipher was solved within a week by a schoolteacher and his wife, who worked on it as a puzzle. The decoded message was disturbing but did not reveal the killer's identity. Instead, it rambled about hunting humans and collecting slaves for the afterlife. It was signed simply, "I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." In a subsequent letter, the killer named himself. "This is the Zodiac speaking." The letter began. He would use this phrase in most of his future communications. The attacks continued. On September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa in Napa County, a man wearing an executioner-style hood approached a couple, Bria Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, who were picnicking by the lake. The man claimed to be an escaped convict and said he needed their car and money. He had a gun. He tied them up with rope, then stabbed them both repeatedly with a knife. Brian survived, despite multiple stab wounds. Cecilia died 2 days later from her injuries. Before leaving, the attacker wrote on Brian's car door in permanent marker the date of the previous Zodiac attacks, followed by the date of this attack and the cross-circle symbol. Brian Hartnell provided a description of his attacker, including the unusual hood and the way the man spoke. But the description was generic enough to fit thousands of men in the Bay Area. Height, weight, build, all average or vague. 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, a taxi driver named Paul Stein was shot and killed in his cab in San Francisco. This attack differed from the previous ones. It was not a couple. It was not in a secluded area. It was in a residential neighborhood. In the city, the Zodiac shot Stein in the head at point-blank range, then removed a section of his shirt, presumably as a trophy. Witnesses saw a man leaving the taxi and walking away calmly. They called the police. Due to a radio dispatch error, responding officers were told to look for a black suspect when witnesses had actually described a white man. Police officers drove past a white man near the scene and did not stop him. That man may have been the Zodiac. In a letter sent days later, the Zodiac included a piece of Paul Stein's shirt, proving he was a killer. He described the crime, mocked the police of their dispatch error, and threatened to target a school bus full of children. This threat caused widespread panic, but was never carried out. The letters continued for years. The Zodiac sent more ciphers, more taunts, more claims. He took credit for additional murders, though investigators could not confirm his involvement in most of these. He sent letters to prominent lawyers, to television shows, to anyone who might give him attention. He seemed to revel in the publicity, in the fear he generated. One of his ciphers, known as a Z340, remained unsolved for 51 years. It was finally decoded in 2020 by a team of codebreakers using modern computational methods. The message was another rambling statement about not being afraid of death and enjoying killing. Like the first cipher, it did not reveal his identity. The investigation into the Zodiac killings became one of the most extensive in American history. Thousands of suspects were investigated. Numerous individuals confessed falsely. The case files grew to contain thousands of pages, but no arrest was ever made. Several suspects emerged as particularly compelling over the years. Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who lived in Vallejo, was investigated extensively. He owned the same type of gun used in some of the attacks. Witnesses placed him near crime scenes. Some acquaintances claimed he had made suspicious statements, but forensic evidence did not match him. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. DNA samples taken from Zodiac letters did not match Allen. He died in 1992, never charged. Other suspects included a former military man with a history of violence, a teacher who moved away from California shortly after the attacks, and various individuals who had connections to the Bay Area during the relevant time period. Each theory had proponents. Each had problems. The case has been analyzed and reanalyzed by professional investigators, amateur sleuths, true crime enthusiasts, and conspiracy theorists. Books have been written, films made, websites dedicated to solving the ciphers and identifying the killer. But despite all this attention, the Zodiac's identity remains unknown. In recent years, advances in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy have offered new hope. The same techniques that solved other cold cases, like the Golden State Killer, have been applied to the Zodiac letters. Partial DNA profiles have been developed from saliva on stamps. But so far, these efforts have not produced a definitive match. The Zodiac Killer represents a particular type of criminal, one who courted publicity, who wanted recognition, who made his crimes into a kind of performance. He was not content to simply kill. He needed to be known, to be feared, to be remembered, and in that, at least he succeeded. But beyond the letters and the ciphers and the symbol, there were real victims, young people whose lives were cut short, families who never got answers, survivors who lived with trauma. The spectacle of the Zodiac should not obscure the actual human cost. The confirmed victims: David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, teenagers on a date; Darlene Ferrin, a young mother; Cecilia Shepard, a college student; Paul Stein, a cab driver working to support himself. These were real people, not characters in a puzzle. They died violently and senselessly, and the person who killed them was never held accountable. The Zodiac case remains officially open with multiple law enforcement agencies. DNA evidence is preserved. Tips are still received and investigated. But as decades pass, the likelihood of identifying the killer diminishes. If the Zodiac was in his 20s or 30s during the attacks, he would be in his 80s or 90s now, if he is still alive. Some believe he may have died years ago, his identity unknown. Others think he is still alive, anonymous, perhaps even aware of the continued attention his crimes receive. The truth is that no one knows. The Zodiac achieved what he seemed to want: infamy without consequence. He killed, he taunted, and he disappeared into the population, never to be definitively identified. What remains of crime scenes, long since changed or built over? The letters, preserved in evidence lockers. The ciphers, some solved, some not. And the questions that have never been answered. Who was he? Why did he stop? And how did he evade identification for more than half a century? 6 cases, 6 investigations, Decades of effort by law enforcement, journalists, and families seeking answers. And yet, the fundamental questions in each case remain unresolved. What connects them is not methodology or motive, but rather the shared experience of confronting a void where explanation should be. These are not cases lacking evidence. Physical evidence exists in all of them. Witnesses provided information. Crime scenes were documented. Investigations were conducted, sometimes exhaustively. And still, the truth remains out of reach. The Istil woman carried false identities and coded notes. Someone knew who she was. Someone might have known what she was doing in that remote valley. But whoever they are, they never came forward. At Hinterkaifeck, someone stayed in that farmhouse for days after killing 6 people. Someone who knew how to care for animals, who felt comfortable enough to sleep there, who was not afraid of being discovered. That person left behind footprints in the snow that led to the farm but not away. The impossible detail that investigators could never explain. In Villisca, 8 people were killed while they slept in a house where the walls were thin and neighbors were close. Someone covered the mirrors and took time to stage the scene. Someone who might have killed similar families in other towns, creating a pattern that was noticed but never proven. The Keddy cabin murders occurred while children slept in the next room. The investigation was mishandled from beginning, evidence lost or contaminated. By the time suspicion focused on credible suspects, those suspects were dead. Justice became impossible not because of insufficient evidence, but because of failures in how that evidence was preserved and pursued. The Springfield Three vanished from a locked house with no signs of struggle, leaving behind everything they would need if they intended to return. They did not return. And in the 30-plus years since, not a single confirmed piece of evidence about their fate has emerged. They exist now only as an absence, a blank space where 3 lives used to be. And the Zodiac, who wanted attention more than anything, who sent us messages and symbols and threats, who killed at least 5 people in confirmed attacks, has never been identified despite being one of the most investigated criminals in American history. What do these cases tell us? They tell us that certainty is more fragile than we imagine, that evidence, no matter how carefully collected, sometimes resists interpretation, that eyewitnesses can be unreliable, that forensic science has limits, that motivated investigators with substantial resources can still fail to solve a case. They also tell us something about how we construct narrative and meaning. When we encounter an event, we instinctively try to make sense of it. We look for motive, for cause and effect, for a story that explains what happened. But some events resist that process. The evidence points in multiple directions or in none. The motive remains opaque. The story cannot be completed because crucial information is missing. In each of these cases, theories exist. Many theories. But theories are not solutions. A solution requires proof verification, the ability to eliminate alternative explanations. None of these cases have reached that threshold. What we're left with are documented mysteries, real events that occurred in real places to real people, recorded in official reports and preserved in archives, but never explained. The families of victims in these cases have had to live with this ambiguity. They know that something terrible happened. They know, in some cases, exactly what happened physically, but they don't know who did it or why. That not knowing becomes its own form of suffering, one that does not diminish with time but rather accumulates, year after year questions without answers. For investigators, these cases represent a particular kind of failure, not a failure of effort, but a failure of outcome. The work was done, the hours were spent, the evidence was analyzed, but the resolution never came. The case files remain open, active in theory if not in practice, waiting for the breakthrough that may never arrive. And for the rest of us, these cases serve as a reminder that the world contains more uncertainty than we usually acknowledge. We live in a society built on the assumption that crimes can be solved, that truth can be discovered, that justice is achievable. Most of the time, that assumption holds. Most murders are solved. Most criminals are caught, but not all. These 6 cases represent the exceptions, the murders that remain unsolved despite every effort, the victims who were never identified, the killers who were never caught. The questions that were asked but never answered. They are not comfortable cases. They do not resolve. They do not provide catharsis or closure. They simply remain persistent and unsettling, documented evidence that sometimes the darkness wins, that sometimes a mystery endures, and that sometimes, despite everything we know and everything we can do, we simply cannot find the truth. The Istel woman lies buried in Bergen in her zinc coffin, waiting for identification that has not come in more than 50 years. The farmhouse at Hinnekavik is gone, demolished less than a year after the murders, but the questions about who stayed there and why remain. The house in Villisca still stands, a memorial to violence that was never explained. Ketty Cabin 28 has been destroyed, but the memory of that April night persists. The families of the Springfield Three continue to wait, hope diminishing but never quite extinguished. And somewhere, perhaps, the Zodiac is still alive, anonymous, watching the continuing obsession with his crimes. These are stories without endings, cases without solutions, mysteries that have outlasted the people who might have solved them, and they remain open, officially, legally, persistently open. Because until someone comes forward with information that can be verified, until evidence emerges that can definitively answer questions, until proof replaces theory, these cases cannot be closed. The silence continues. The questions persist. And somewhere in archives and evidence lockers, the documents wait. Crime scene photographs, witness statements, physical evidence, all of it preserved, all of it available, all of it insufficient. This is what unsolved means. Not that nothing is known, but that what is known is not enough. Not that no one tried, but that try was not sufficient. Not that the truth does not exist, but that it remains hidden, protected by time, by death, by circumstance, or by someone's deliberate choice to remain silent. 6 cases, dozens of victims, hundreds of investigators, thousands of hours of work, decades of time, and still we do not know. Perhaps we never will.